In August of 1995, Elena Warner, hitchhiking in Colorado, stopped a fellow hitchhiker on Highway 82. From that moment on, she was officially reported missing. For 15 years, she was presumed dead until an accident in October 2010 revealed the terrible truth about her fate. The girl was found, but where exactly she was all this time, who was her torturer, and why she tried to protect him despite the hell she had gone through, you will find out right now. Enjoy your viewing. Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. On Thursday, August 24, 1995, the hot asphalt of Interstate 82 emitted a stifling haze that blurred the horizons of Independence Pass. It was on this sunny afternoon that 18-year-old Elena Warner, a first-year student at the University of Colorado, locked the door of her parents' Aspen home. She planned to hitchhike to Twin Lakes, where friends were waiting for her for a traditional weekend camping trip. According to the description in the wanted postcard, Elena was wearing a white t-shirt, short jean shorts, and carrying a blue mountain sports backpack. The last person to see the girl alive was a truck driver, Samuel Rigby. His testimony, recorded in a police report dated August 25th, became the only time reference point in the first hours of the investigation. At 5:15 in the evening, he was driving past the entrance to the White River National Forest. According to Rigby, the girl was standing on the side of the road, her backpack clutched to her feet. She looked confident. Even the sun blinding her eyes didn't prevent me from seeing her calm smile. Elena simply raised her hand, a short gesture, with no sign of anxiety or haste. The place where Elena last appeared, Independence Pass, is located at an altitude of 12,095 feet above sea level. This is a rugged area of granite cliffs and dense coniferous forests where the air becomes thin and cold as soon as the sun touches the tops of the pines. Highway 82 narrows to a serpentine stretch where deep gullies filled with juniper and rocks open up on either side of the road. It was here, in the white silence of the highlands, that Elena took her last step. At 22 o'clock that evening, Michael Warner, the girl's father, made the first call to the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department. According to the call log, the man was extremely concerned. Elena was supposed to call after arriving in Twin Lakes at 20 o'clock, but there was no contact. The official search began at dawn the next day, August 25th, 1995, at 6 o'clock in the morning. The search operation covered a 20-mile radius from the entrance to the White River Forest. More than 50 volunteers, canine teams, and a Forest Service helicopter were involved. Among those who first arrived to help was 32-year-old Thomas Miller, a local resident and expert on mountain trails. In the documents of the operational headquarters, he is listed as an expert with detailed knowledge of the terrain and abandoned mine passages in this sector. Miller participated in combing the most inaccessible areas, deep gorges and old stream beds where, according to rescuers' experience, traces of accidents are most often found. For the first 48 hours, the rescuers methodically examined every square yard of land along the highway. They were looking for anything: a piece of white cloth, a torn strap of a blue backpack, or a shoe print on dry ground. But the forest remained eerily silent. According to the sinologist's report, 3 sniffer dogs picked up a trail near the road sign where Elena was standing, but it suddenly broke off at the very edge of the asphalt. This indicated that the girl had gotten into a car and left the area without leaving any signs of struggle. In the final report for the first week of the search, Sheriff Robert Lewis noted an important detail. "We have checked all possible stopping places and vantage points within a 30-mile radius heading east. Not a single sign of the victim's presence, not a handful of ashes from a campfire, no signs of sitting on the ground, no crumpled grass." Search teams walked along the rocky outcrops where travelers usually stop to rest, but did not find even an empty water bottle or food wrapper. The situation has reached a dead end. Elena Warner has simply disappeared into thin air among the endless Colorado mountain ranges. No witnesses have been found who would have seen the suspicious vehicles, nor has there been any material evidence to help us understand where she was headed. Highway 82 continued to hum with car engines, but for the Warner family, it was the beginning of an endless journey into the unknown that would last for many years. 15 years is 5,478 days of silence, which for the Warner family has become familiar but unbearable. The case of Elena Warner, which once occupied the front pages of newspapers throughout Colorado, gradually turned into a pile of dusty files in the Pitkin County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit. The investigators who started the search in 1995 retired, and a new generation of detectives perceived the girl's disappearance near Independence Pass as part of local folklore, a tragic story about how the mountains can swallow a person without a trace. However, in October of 2010, nature, which had long been hiding the truth, decided to speak up. That fall, the state was hit by abnormal rains. According to reports from the Weather Service, a monthly rainfall fell in 3 days, which provoked large-scale flooding. The Roaring Fork River overflowed its banks, and groundwater in the suburb of Snowmass Village rose so high that it began to erode the foundations of houses and wash away the roots of ancient trees. Snowmass Village, located only 5 miles from where Elena was last seen, has always been considered a quiet and safe neighborhood that was not even considered an area of interest during the initial search. On October 12, 2010, a local resident, 60-year-old Arthur Pringle, was inspecting his property after the water receded. His property bordered a wooded area with a giant old elm tree, estimated to be over 80 years old. The flood had eroded the soil at its base to a depth of more than 2 feet, exposing a tangle of thick, vein-like roots. In his statement to police recorded that evening, Pringle said, "I just wanted to check if the tree was going to fall on my shed. As I got closer, I noticed something bright tangled in the black silt between the roots. At first, I thought it was just some debris the water had brought in, but when the sun reflected off the metal, I realized it was a piece of jewelry." Pringle pulled a thin, broken silver chain out of the mud. On it hung a pendant in the shape of a stylized mountain peak. The piece was very darkened from being in the ground for a long time, but it retained its shape. A man who remembered the story of the missing girl. In such small communities, the memory of such tragedies lives on for decades, immediately called the sheriff's office. When Detective Marcus Thorne, who was then in charge of investigating old cases, received the discovery, he ordered Michael Warner to be called in immediately. The identification took place on October 13th at 10 o'clock in the morning. According to the officers who were present in the office, Elena's father recognized the item instantly. It was the designer pendant he had given his daughter for her 18th birthday, just 3 months before she disappeared. Michael recalled that Elena never took off this jewelry, considering it her lucky charm. The fact that the chain was broken pointed to one thing: it was not lost by accident. It was torn off the girl's neck during a struggle or after the use of force. The discovery under the old elm tree forced the detectives to completely revise the archived materials of 1995. The main question that stumped the investigation was, how did the personal belongings of a girl who disappeared on Route 82 end up 5 miles from the point of last contact and on private property in Snowmass Village? A geographic analysis of the area pointed to a terrible logical error in the search operation of 15 years ago. Back then, in '95, the main forces, more than 50 volunteers and professional rescuers, were concentrated on the mountain slopes and along the Roaring Fork River bed in the direction of the current. Everyone assumed that Elena had either gotten lost in the thicket or had been the victim of an accident and fallen into the water. No one could have guessed that she was in a residential area, hidden behind the fences of private property. The old elm tree at Pringle's site became a symbolic starting point for a new phase of the investigation. investigators brought in a team of forensic anthropologists to examine the soil around the tree in detail. For 48 hours, a 100-foot radius of the area was sifted through fine sieves. Detective Thorne noted in his report, "We were looking for biological remains, bone or tooth fragments. If the jewelry was here, there was a strong possibility that Helena herself was buried somewhere nearby under a layer of earth that has only become denser over the past 15 years. However, the earth gave up nothing more than the chain. This only added to the mystery. If the body was not nearby, how could the pendant have gotten into the roots of the tree? An examination showed that the chain had been in the soil for at least 10 years. The flood only brought it to the surface, revealing a mystery that had been hiding under the feet of the residents of Snowmass Village for years. This case caused a real media explosion in Colorado. TV channels began to broadcast photos of young Elena Warner again, and the police officially changed the status of the case from probable accident to kidnapping and murder. Investigators began to pull up lists of all property owners in the area as of 1,995. They realized that the answer was not in the wild mountains, but very close by, in the shadows of cozy homes, where 15 years ago, someone very cautious had managed to deceive both the law and an entire search party. Detective Thorne, analyzing old reports, noticed another detail. In '95, the volunteers who combed this sector reported that the territory of private households was visually inspected. No suspicious objects were found. This meant that law enforcement officers then simply trusted the silence of these places, not suspecting that hell could be hiding behind high fences and soundproof walls. The silver chain became the very key that began to open the door to a past that everyone would like to forget. But none of the detectives at that time could even imagine that the discovery under the elm tree was just the tiny tip of the iceberg of horror that had been going on all these years right next to them. When the case of Helena Warner was officially reopened in October 2010, detectives turned to the primary sources, the yellowed logbooks of the volunteers who participated in the initial search in 1,995. On page 18 of the archival record, at number 34, was a name that had not previously aroused any suspicion: Thomas Miller. A careful analysis of his activities during that critical phase of the investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that was so flawless that it became the perfect camouflage. Miller was not just helping. He was the architect of the information vacuum in which the investigation had been operating for 15 years. According to operational reports, Miller, then 32 years old, arrived at the headquarters of the search operation on August 25, 1,995, at 7 o'clock in the morning, only an hour after the official start of the work. In the qualifications column, he indicated local knowledge of trails, experienced rock climber, knowledge of cave systems of the White River Forest. For Sheriff Robert Lewis, who was under tremendous pressure from the press and the Warner family, Miller was a real find. He was a quiet, methodical man who never complained of fatigue and always took on the most grueling routes. In the testimony of a former sheriff's deputy, Harrison Fox, recorded during a retrospective review of the case, Miller was described as a shadow man. Fox recalled, "Thomas was always around, but he never drew too much attention to himself. While the other volunteers were loudly discussing theories around the campfire or arguing about routes, he was just studying maps. He knew every ravine, every cave, and every abandoned mine within a 20-mile radius. When he spoke, people listened to him because his knowledge of the area seemed absolute. It was this authority that allowed Miller to make a key maneuver that led the investigation astray for years. On the third day of the search, August 27, 1995. When tensions were at their peak, Thomas Miller addressed a meeting of the operational headquarters. According to Protocol Number 14, he provided an expert assessment. Miller convinced the sheriff that, given the fast flow of the Roaring Fork River after recent rains, the girl most likely slipped on slippery rocks, fell into the water, and was carried many miles downstream, where the channel becomes cluttered and impassable. He justified this by saying that he had personally checked the shoreline and noticed characteristic landslides near one of the dangerous ledges. This version was so convenient for the exhausted rescuers that it was accepted as the main one. It explained the absence of the body, the absence of belongings, and the complete lack of any evidence of abduction. The river became a convenient excuse for the impotence of the law. Over the next weeks, volunteers focused on the waterways, completely ignoring residential areas and private territories located just a few miles from Route 82. After the active phase of the search was wrapped up, Thomas Miller returned to his usual, almost transparent existence. He worked at a local hardware store called Mountain Peak Supply, which was located on the outskirts of Aspen. It was the perfect place for a man of his stature, a quiet warehouse, the smell of fresh sawdust, metal tools, and grease. Colleagues and regular customers described him as a reliable but extremely taciturn professional. He knew everything about construction, soundproofing materials, concrete mixes, and complex hydraulic systems. One of the residents of Snowmass Village, who had been buying building materials from Miller for 10 years, later told detectives, "Thomas was the kind of guy who would help you load heavy bags of cement into your pickup truck and never say a word. He was never late for work, had no bad habits, and was not involved in any of the town's disputes. He just existed on the periphery of your vision, like a part of the landscape that you see every day but never study in detail." Miller's daily life outside of the store was even more private. He lived on his Willow Creek estate, which was surrounded by dense coniferous forest and a high fence. Neighbors, whose homes were at least half a mile away, rarely saw him in the yard. According to utility records, his home's energy consumption had been stable for all 15 years, with no spikes that could have attracted attention. He was a master of disguise in everyday life. His lawn was always perfectly mowed, and his mailbox never piled up. His absolute invisibility to justice was also ensured by the fact that Miller had no criminal record. His name appeared in the Colorado police databases only once, in connection with the renewal of his firearms license. He had never been a speeder, had never gotten into a bar fight, and showed no signs of psychological instability. To others, he was just a quiet neighbor from the hardware store who had once been a heroic volunteer searching for a missing girl. However, behind this veil of normalcy was a man who knew exactly why Elena Warner could not be found in the Roaring Fork River. While Sheriff Lewis was writing in the accident reports, Miller was passing by the stands with wanted posters every morning on which Elena's face was gradually fading in the sun. His reputation as a trustworthy man was a shield he forged himself, using the community's trust as material for his cover. For 5,478 days, he remained above suspicion, part of the very system that was supposed to expose him. His normal life at Mountain Peak Place continued unchanged, even as modern technology began to change the world. He ignored the fashion for smartphones or the internet, remaining true to his habits and his silence. No one knew that every night after the store closed, this reliable man disappeared behind the gates of Willow Creek, where time stood still for another person the world had already begun to forget. While hundreds of volunteers combed the rocky slopes and peered into every crevice near Independence Pass, Ellen Warner's real prison was only 5 miles from her home. The Willow Creek estate, owned by Thomas Miller, looked like a typical suburban estate on the outside, a manicured lawn surrounded by hedges and a massive wooden workshop from which the sound of a circular saw could often be heard. But beneath this veneer of normalcy was an engineering structure designed with cold-blooded precision. A forensic examination conducted much later revealed that the basement under the workshop was not just a storage facility, but a professionally equipped bunker where every inch of space was used to completely isolate the facility. The room, about 250 square feet in size, was 12 feet below the workshop's concrete foundation. The walls were constructed of a double layer of reinforced concrete, each 10 inches thick. Between the layers, Miller laid a special soundproofing composite, commonly used in professional recording studios or military installations. This meant that even if Elena were to scream at the top of her lungs, the sound of her voice would never reach the surface. Air was supplied to the chamber through a system of hidden ventilation ducts disguised as ordinary drainage pipes on the site. The lighting was exclusively artificial, fluorescent lamps that worked according to a strict schedule, creating the illusion of day and night. According to the reports of psychologists who analyzed the conditions of her stay, Miller did not just hold the girl physically. He systematically destroyed her personality through disinformation. During the first months of her captivity in 1995, he convinced Elena that the world outside these walls had ceased to exist as she knew it. Using fake radio recordings and falsified newspaper clippings, he painted a picture of a global catastrophe that allegedly occurred shortly after she was saved by him. The most brutal element of his psychological game was a lie about the fate of her family. 1 month after Elena's disappearance, in September of 1995, Miller brought her the news of a terrible car accident. He claimed that her parents had died on the spot trying to find her in the mountains. To reinforce this legend, he produced a fake obituary that looked like a clipping from a local Aspen newspaper. Miller convinced the girl that she was all alone and that he was the only living soul who knew of her existence and was willing to risk himself to feed her and protect her from the dangerous chaos outside. Testimony from forensic experts indicates that Miller enjoyed his role as a benefactor. He brought her portions of food every night that he called scarce supplies, making it seem that each bowl of soup was the result of his heroic efforts in the outside world. The room had no windows, clocks, or any devices that would allow real time to be tracked. 15 years of captivity turned into an endless cycle of waiting for footsteps overhead for Elena. Every sound of the hydraulic lock opening on the heavy door became a moment of truth for her. Whether it would bring good news today or tell her again how the world around her continues to rot. Miller used his knowledge gained at the hardware store to keep the bunker in top condition. He installed a water filtration system and a standalone generator, which allowed Willow Creek to function even when the city's power grid was cut off. This gave the victim the illusion of complete dependence on the technological genius of her captor. Elena found herself in a situation where her brain, trying to survive, began to perceive the executioner as her only protector. Experts would later call this a classic manifestation of traumatic bonding, exacerbated by complete sensory deprivation and the absence of any alternative sources of information for 5,500 days. Inside the bunker was a small shelf with books and tapes that Miller carefully selected. These were materials about survival in extreme conditions and religious texts that emphasized the theme of humility and gratitude for rescue. Every object in this cell was a tool of manipulation. Elena did not have access to mirrors, which for 15 years deprived her of understanding how she was changing and aging. She remained an 18-year-old girl in her mind, locked in a concrete vault while the real world 10 inches away continued on its way, unaware of the existence of this parallel universe beneath Willow Creek. On October 20th, 2010, a thick fog hung over Pitkin County, which turned into freezing rain. At dusk, the air temperature plummeted to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the wet asphalt of Route 82 into a mirror trap. It was on this evening at approximately 9:30 that the flawlessly worked mechanism of Thomas Miller's life gave its first and fatal failure. According to a Colorado State Highway Patrol report, Miller's silver pickup truck was traveling toward Snowmass Village at a speed of about 55 miles per hour. On one of the most treacherous stretches of Serpentine Road, where the road makes a sharp turn over a deep ravine, the vehicle hit a patch of black ice. Investigator Dan Riley, who arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, noted in the report, "There were virtually no signs of braking. The vehicle lost traction, pierced a metal guardrail, and went into a ditch, flipping several times before coming to rest at the bottom of the slope 40 feet below." Witnesses to the accident, a couple of young men driving by in the opposite direction, immediately called the emergency services. According to them, the pickup looked like a pile of mangled metal, and the driver was pinned in the cab by deployed airbags and a deformed steering column. It took the rescuers over 45 minutes to free the man from the trap using hydraulic tools. Thomas Miller was in a state of deep unconsciousness. He was rushed to the Valley View Hospital in Glenwood Springs, 40 miles away from the accident site. The medical record, dated October 21, 2010, stated, "Patient admitted with open head injury, multiple rib fractures, and internal bleeding. Critical condition, induced coma to stabilize vital signs." Miller became nameless patient number 412 because his papers were scattered across the cab during the accident and were not immediately found by police among the wreckage and mud. While the medics fought for the kidnapper's life, absolute dead silence reigned at Willow Creek Manor. For Elena Warner, 12 feet underground, this evening began like thousands of others. She was used to navigating time by the subtle vibrations of footsteps overhead and the dull click of the hydraulic door drive, which usually occurred at 10 o'clock at night. It was her only connection to reality, her clock, which had never failed her for 15 years. That night, however, the familiar sound did not come. 10 o'clock passed, then 11, but the soundproofed walls of the bunker continued to remain motionless. According to later reconstructions by psychologists, the first hours of the delay were the beginning of a previously unknown nightmare for Elena. In her distorted reality, which Miller had been building for years, any absence of a savior meant only one thing: the outside world, whose catastrophe he had been constantly telling her about, had finally reached her. Elena was in a state of complete informational and physical isolation. She did not know about the accident on the highway, did not know that the person she considered her only protector was lying in a hospital bed under a ventilator. The bunker began to get cold as the autonomous heating system, which Miller adjusted every night, switched to an economical mode. The silence that had previously been just a backdrop to her captivity now became tangible, heavy, and threatening. For the next 48 hours, the Willow Creek house remained empty. The mailbox began to pile up with rain-soaked correspondence, and the light in the workshop, which Miller had forgotten to turn off before leaving, continued to burn a dim yellow light, unable to open the heavy metal door, which was locked with a sophisticated electronic lock. Elena found herself trapped inside a trap. 15 years of routine were broken not by police efforts, but by a blind accident on a slippery road. A woman who had forgotten how to believe in miracles was now left alone with an emptiness where every minute of silence took away the remnants of her hope that tomorrow would ever come. In the big world, Thomas Miller was just another unknown in critical condition, but underground he remained a god who suddenly disappeared, leaving his creation to die in darkness. On October 23, 2010, an unnatural, heavy silence reigned over the Willow Creek estate, unbroken even by the gusts of autumn wind. In the big world, Thomas Miller was in a deep coma at Glenwood Springs Hospital. His pickup truck, which had blown off Interstate 82, had already been towed to the impound lot as a pile of mangled metal. But underground, 12 feet below ground, time had stood still for another man. Elena Warner had been in complete darkness and silence for over 72 hours. According to later medical reports, these 3 days were the most difficult ordeal of her 15 years of captivity. Without food, and most importantly, without water, the 33-year-old woman's body began to rapidly decline. The bunker's autonomous life support system, deprived of Miller's control, worked in emergency mode. The ventilation produced only a weak stream of stolen air, and the lights were completely turned off by an electronic timer that no one had the power to reset. In this absolute emptiness, Elena realized for the first time that her savior would not come. Her brain, poisoned for years by manipulations about the lost world, began to draw pictures of the final end. She didn't know about the accident. She believed that what Miller had warned her about had finally happened, and she was the last person in the concrete grave. At 11 o'clock that morning, an old sedan pulled up to the house. It was Martha Miller, Thomas's 80-year-old mother, who lived in another part of town. The woman was concerned that her son hadn't answered his phone for 3 days and had come to feed his cat, Barnaby. In her statement to the police that evening, Marta recalled, "The house greeted me with coldness. Thomas never left the workshop door open, but this time the lock was barely covered. I thought he was in a hurry, but the silence inside was so thick that I was afraid to even breathe." The woman walked through the kitchen to the garage where Thomas spent most of his time. It was there, amid the smell of oil and fresh sawdust, that she heard a sound that will always be etched in her memory. It was a faint but rhythmic scraping sound, the sound of metal on concrete, coming from under the massive work racks that held heavy tools and supplies of building materials. The scraping repeated every 10 seconds, as if someone was trying to send a signal with their last breath. The terrified woman, whose imagination was drawing pictures of burglars hiding in the crawl space, immediately dialed the emergency number, 911. Patrol officers David Copeland and Lisa Green arrived at Willow Creek 12 minutes later. According to Officer Copeland's report, an initial inspection of the garage revealed no signs of forced entry. However, they did hear the sound Martha had mentioned. It was a scratching sound coming from right under the floor. The experienced Copeland noticed a thin, almost invisible seam line in the concrete floor that ran along the back wall behind the shelving. Behind the shelving was a hidden niche with a control panel. When the officer pressed one of the buttons, a heavy mechanical hum sounded in the silence of the garage. A massive concrete slab, driven by a sophisticated hydraulic actuator, began to slowly slide away, revealing the black mouth of the dungeon. As the report states, a heavy odor of mustiness, dampness, and stale sweat came from the open hole. It was the smell of a place where a person had been for years without access to fresh air. The officers pulled out their flashlights and began descending a metal staircase that led to a depth of 12 feet. The beams of the flashlights snatched out of the darkness walls, covered in dark soundproofing material that absorbed light. In the corner of the small room, on a narrow bed, sat a woman. She was incredibly pale, almost transparent, and her hair, once golden, was now gray and tangled. She had her hands tightly over her face, hiding from the bright light of the lanterns, which was causing her physical pain after 3 days of complete darkness and 15 years of dim lamps. She was clutching an ordinary metal mug, which she was using to scrape at the ventilation grill, hoping for a miracle. "Are you Thomas?" was the first question she asked in a weak, hoarse voice, according to Officer Lisa Green's testimony. When she was told that they were police, the woman did not show joy. Instead, her body shook with convulsive terror. She didn't believe in rescue, because for her, the world outside this basement no longer existed. 15 years of silence were broken by the sound of strange, unfamiliar voices that seemed to her like a threat, not hope. Officer Green came closer and spoke softly. "We are here to get you out of here. What is your name?" The woman slowly lowered her hands, and in the light of the flashlight, the police saw a face they had only seen on old wanted posters. She looked much older than her 33 years, but her features were unmistakably Elena Warner. She looked at the police officers with eyes that had been unaccustomed to reality and said, "Elena, my name is Elena Warner. Please, don't let him know you found me." The process of bringing Elena to the surface took over 40 minutes. Her muscles were so atrophied that she was unable to climb the steep stairs on her own. Officer Copeland carried her out in his arms, covering her with his jacket to protect her from the daylight. When they left the garage, Elena found the aspen autumn sky unbearably bright. She closed her eyes and began to shiver as she breathed in the air, which for the first time in 5,478 days did not smell like concrete and grease. An ambulance had already arrived, and yellow tape was being placed around the Willow Creek estate. The world had just learned of the return of someone it had buried 15 years earlier, but Elena herself did not know that her journey to true freedom had just begun. When Elena Warner was finally brought to daylight in October 2010, the truth that began to emerge was far more frightening than any assumptions that had been made over the previous 15 years. According to the materials of the first interrogations and medical examinations, it all began on a sunny evening on August 24, 1995, at Independence Pass. Thomas Miller, who was 32 years old at the time, stopped his pickup truck near a girl standing on the side of Highway 82. Miller looked like an ordinary, polite man who simply offered to help. His calm manner and sincere smile lulled the 18-year-old into a state of vigilance. Within minutes of getting into the car, he took advantage of the moment when Elena turned to the window to administer a medical drug that instantly rendered her unconscious. For the next 5,478 days, Elena's life was sacrificed to Miller's morbid desire for total power. According to the reports of forensic psychologists, the kidnapper's main motive was not ransom or ordinary physical violence, but the creation of a closed universe where he could be the only law and the only God. For Elena, he became the personification of all living things left on the planet. Miller enjoyed the fact that it was his will that determined whether she would see the light of the lamp under the concrete ceiling, whether she would receive a meal today, and whether she would hear a single living word. He methodically built the walls of her psychological prison, making them stronger than the concrete of Willow Creek. The most sophisticated torture tool was total disinformation. Miller brought fake newspapers to the basement for years and played audio recordings he had edited himself. These false reports showed the world outside the bunker as being engulfed in wars, epidemics, and social chaos. He convinced Elena that her parents and brother had died in a car accident just 1 month after her disappearance. He told her that no one had even tried to look for her, that her friends had long forgotten her name, and that the police had closed the case in a week. Miller created the image of a last defender, convincing the girl that he was the only person on earth who cared about her life and who risked himself every day to ensure her safety in a ruined world. According to the testimonies of psychotherapists who worked with Elena after her release, it is known that at first she understood the abnormality of the situation and tried to resist. However, time and complete isolation did their job. After 5 years in frozen time, when no other source of information refuted Miller's words, her brain began to accept this distorted reality. She began to feel wildly grateful to her torturer for not leaving her to starve to death in the dark. It was a classic manifestation of traumatic dissociation, where the line between enemy and savior was completely erased. Elena's physical condition at the time of her rescue was critical. The examination showed that her skin had become waxy, almost translucent pale, due to the lack of natural sunlight for 180 months. Her leg muscles had atrophied to the point where she had almost forgotten how to walk, moving around the dungeon with short. When the officers brought her to the surface, the daylight caused her not only tears, but also real physical pain, as if hot needles were digging into her eyeballs. Mentally, she was in a state of deep horror. She did not believe that the men in uniform were real, believing them to be part of another hallucination or Miller's cruel game. She had no hope of being rescued because in her mind there was no one to save her. However, the biggest shock for Elena was the sight of the modern world she saw through the window of a police car on the way to the hospital in Aspen. When she disappeared in 1995, cell phones were rare and the internet was just beginning to develop. Now, in 2010, bright neon signs, Flat-screen monitors at gas stations and smartphones in the hands of almost every passerby seemed to her like technology from a science fiction movie. Seeing the full, vibrant life on the streets of the city, where people were laughing, drinking coffee, and hurrying about their business, she experienced an acute nervous shift. Her brain refused to accept the truth. The world was not dead. It was thriving. She realized that while she was slowly dying of loneliness and despair in a concrete cell, her family was only 5 miles away. All the while, they continued to love her, searching through the years and hoping for a miracle. The medical report stated, "The patient fell into a catatonic stupor after realizing the extent of the lie. She repeated only one phrase, 'I was so close.'" It turned out that the real tragedy was not only the walls of the basement, but the fact that 15 years of her youth had been simply erased from reality, sacrificed to the madness of a man who passed by her home every day. The world continued on its way, and for only one person did it stop in August '95, leaving her alone with the darkness while a story was happening outside her doorstep that she never had a hand in. During the examination of the dungeon, forensic experts found a warehouse of evidence of Miller's manipulations, hundreds of neatly cut out newspaper articles about disasters, which he had altered by pasting the names of her friends and relatives. On the table was a tape recorder with specially recorded sounds of explosions and sirens, which he turned on the ventilation during attacks from outside. Each of these items was a brick in the wall that separated Elena from reality. When she finally realized that Miller was not her hero, but the sole cause of her hell, that wall collapsed, leaving behind only the ashes of years of life lost that could not be regained. The news of Elena Warner's release spread through Pitkin County like wildfire, and by the morning of October 24, 2010, it had become a national sensation. Television stations interrupted their broadcasts to report the unbelievable. The girl whose name had been synonymous with hopeless disappearance for 15 years was alive. At the gates of the Willow Creek estate, which was now surrounded by dozens of FBI officers and forensic scientists, lines of reporters lined up. However, the real drama unfolded in the sterile corridors of the Glenwood Springs Hospital, where Elena was undergoing the first stages of detoxification and examination. The most emotional moment that stuck in the memory of the medical staff was when Elena met her family. Her father, Michael Warner, who had turned into a gray-haired, hunched man over the years, seemed to have aged decades. Leo, Elena's younger brother, stood next to him. In 1995, he was just a 10-year-old boy who waited for his sister at the window every night, hoping to see her blue backpack. Now, in 2010, Elena stood before a grown, broad-shouldered man in the uniform of a Colorado mountain rescue. Leo had dedicated his life to finding people precisely because of his family's tragedy, and the symbolism of him bringing her out of the dungeon broke the hearts of millions of Americans. According to the testimony of Nurse Ann Richter, who was present during the first contact, Elena did not recognize her brother at first. She looked at him with fear, trying to find the features of that childish face that her memory had captured 15 years ago. Only when Leo handed her an old, worn photograph that he had carried in his breast pocket all these years did she begin to cry. It was the first genuine emotional release after years of dissociative numbness. For Elena, this moment was a painful realization that time had not only passed, it had changed everything around her, leaving her the only one stuck in the last century. While the family tried to repair the ties that had been severed, in another wing of the same medical center, the fate of her tormentor was being decided. Thomas Miller was in a deep coma caused by brain swelling after the accident on Route 82. Police had set up round-the-clock security outside his room, hoping for at least one chance to interrogate him. Investigators had hundreds of questions. Were there other victims? Did anyone help him build this bunker? But the truth remained behind the closed doors of his mind. On October 26, 2010, at 3 o'clock in the morning, medical monitors recorded a cardiac arrest. Thomas Miller died without regaining consciousness. He passed away, taking with him the answers to many questions, but most importantly, he lost his power over Elena forever. The process of Elena Warner's rehabilitation has become the subject of many scientific works. She had to relearn everything from walking on atrophied muscles to trusting people. During the first months, she could not stay in rooms with closed doors and was panicked by the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Her skin gradually lost its waxy pallor under the rays of the real sun, but her psychological wounds were much deeper. It took her a long time to get used to modern technology, perceiving the internet and touch screens as something hostile and incomprehensible. The world, which according to Miller was supposed to be destroyed, turned out to be too fast and noisy for her. Despite her serious condition, Elena demonstrated incredible willpower. A year after her release, she was able to return to Independence Pass, accompanied by her brother and father. She wanted to see the place where her life was split in two. There, among the granite rocks, she left a silver chain with a mountain peak on it, the same one that helped find her. It was her personal ritual of saying goodbye to Miller's shadow. Helen Warner's story remains in Colorado archives as a reminder that even in the most secure communities, behind the doors of quiet neighbors, darkness can lurk that professional search teams cannot discern, who was able to return from 15 years of oblivion and find her place in the sun again. The world has never forgotten her, and it was this collective memory and an accident on a slippery serpentine slope that became the keys that unlocked the door to her new life. Elena began her long journey to healing, knowing that now there was only the endless sky above her head, not the concrete slab of Willow Creek.